This week, I built a project so large that it pushes the limits of my tiny apartment garage, make a boatload of mistakes,
Son of a... I messed this one up.
try a small blue pill for the very first time, and immediately lose a giant pile of cash before I even got started. Let's start with the money thing. From the moment I started this project, this was an absolute nightmare to deal with. So I initially went out and bought a bunch of rough sawn lumber, as I always do because it's a lot cheaper and you can just get higher quality lumber. But you'll notice what I have here is already pre-surfaced. That's because I spent about $1,000 on rough sawn lumber, brought it back to my shop, and realized because of the space, I literally have no way to mill that stuff down to get it flat. So I had to go back to the lumber yard, this time completely on the opposite side of town, and spend about $1,500 on more lumber that was pre-surfaced. And that's what I'm doing here, just kind of breaking everything down into some smaller sizes. Now, like I said, I don't have the ability with how small my shop is to flatten the boards to get that top and the bottom perfectly parallel with one another, which is why I had to spend about 2 to 3 times the money and get pre-surfaced material. But one thing that I definitely can do is joint the boards on the edges. So the technique that I always like to do, because I find it to be the fastest and easiest, is to just use my track saw. Now, this track is insanely long, and it cost me about $500 to buy. And to be honest with you, I don't really think getting a long track like this is really worth it. I've shown in a past video where instead of using a long track like this, I'll instead use 2 shorter tracks to join them. And truthfully, I think that is a much, much better idea than paying $500-$600 for this track. But now that I've got a perfectly straight line or a jointed edge on a board, I can run it through my table saw. And you can see that I run into a lot of issues working in a shop this small when I'm trying to do a project this big. My boards are hitting the back wall of the garage, and when I try to push the board all the way through, it's out of camera, but I'm also hitting the garage door. This is just something I've kind of grown accustomed to, and see, there you go, I can't push it all the way through and I gotta stop, but luckily they cut finishes. With boards this long, I'm sure these are right around 9 feet or so, I'm absolutely gonna need some sort of alignment aid to make sure that these boards stay perfectly level with one another. There are tons of different options that you could use for this. You could use biscuits, you could use dowels, you could use those Rockler beadlock tenon things, but what I'm going to use because it's fast and efficient is the domino.
No, God!
This is not sponsored. I bought this thing for myself, and it makes panel glue-ups super fast. And if you want to do it even faster, try using my patented hip thrust technique. It works super well. To accomplish this, just put both of your hands on the top side.
And pelvic thrust! Woo!
Hey, that's my thing.
Well, this is awkward. I didn't think you'd catch me on that one, Jason. It does work well, though. Thanks for the tip, man. Now, one of the biggest gripes that I hear about the domino is the cost of all of the additional accessories. So these little guys that you put in, they're called the dominoes, and the mortises, they do cost a lot of money. So a lot of people think that making them yourself is going to save you tons and tons of money. And I did too, which is why I built a lot of them out of scrap material. And then I realized that after all of the time and effort that you put into making these, I would much rather just buy them and not waste my time. After these are gone, I will never make my own dominoes again. As you can see with how long these boards are, those dominoes do help kind of pull everything into plane, and now I can get this massive glue up all settled, and just like that, boom, perfect edges without a joiner. The track saw works perfect for stuff like this. Now, one thing you definitely do want to keep in mind is that when you're gluing up panels, you do not need a lot of clamping pressure. You need just enough to get that thin line of squeeze out with the glue. And one of the things I like to do on the ends is clamp the boards together. And you can see that kind of pulls everything in plane because I can't really put a domino there. And just to make sure that I don't get any bowing or warping, I'll also put a couple clamps in the opposite direction. Is this 100% necessary? No, but it's a nice insurance policy, and if you have the clamps, you might as well give it a shot. And to make my life easier, I'll clean up a little bit of that glue squeeze out with some water and a damp rag, and I can set this board to the side and keep working.
So now that I've got that larger panel made, I want to be able to cut this down into the two sides and the top of the case. But before I do that, I want to bring your attention in here because there are a couple small things I need to fix first. There are several cracks or knots like this, and those need to be addressed before we move on.
Now, yes, in an ideal world, you wouldn't buy lumber that has all these knot holes and everything, but it's really not that big of an issue. All that you have to do is start off by taking all the extra junk, all the loose wood out of the voids, and then on the bottom side, get a little packing tape, nothing fancy, and we're gonna kind of move on. And you wanna see a quick magic trick? Ryobi hot glue gun, DeWalt battery, it works. So what I like to do here is I take some hot glue and I make a little bit of a dam around each of the voids. What this will do is create a safe space where when I go to pour epoxy, none of that epoxy is going to really leak all over the place. It's going to keep it contained and make things way less messy. And speaking of epoxy, I like to use this stuff here. I'll leave a link down in the description where you can get a discount, but the reason I like it is that the pumps do all of the work. I don't have to measure out ratios and weigh things. All I do is use one pump of resin, one pump of hardener, and I'm done. It's easy. And then because I want this to kind of match and blend in a little bit, I add a little bit of black pigment, and then you can see that those hot glue dams allow that epoxy to really sit in the void and not spill out all over the place. I always put extra epoxy because over time it's going to seep in, and that hot glue dam will just make sure that the void is totally filled. And you'll also get some bubbles, but a heat gun will help pop those bubbles, as you can see, crystal clear. And with movie magic, the epoxy is now rock hard and totally cured. Now, this is one thing I kind of tried to edit out, but I wanted to be honest with you. Sometimes getting this hot glue off can be an absolute nightmare. As you can see, I'm just getting little teeny tiny chunks off of it. And this is absolutely one of those processes that I'm kind of looking to change up this year, maybe find a new way to do it. But for right now, it's kind of the best thing that I've got. Now, one of the other things that I'm really trying this year is to start using some hand tools. So this is a card scraper, which it's basically just a flat piece of steel that has a little edge on it. And to my surprise, these things actually work pretty well. As you can see, I was able to take all that junk off and give a pretty clean surface without having to gum up tons and tons of sandpaper. And then on the opposite side, I can peel up that tape, and you can see that it filled that void really nicely. And while I absolutely could use that card scraper on all these panels,
Ain't nobody got time for that.
it's going to be way easier for me to just run it through my planer. And here's what I mean about having a small shop. These boards are so long that while the board is feeding through the planer, I have to actually move my planer so that I can get the board to the other side. Not an ideal scenario, but you gotta do what you gotta do in a small shop. And now that I've got those panels milled down perfectly flat, I need to bring them to their final width. And with using long boards like this, I really find that these Jessam hold down clamp things work super well, and they keep the board going perfectly straight against the fence. As you can see, I hit the garage door again. Now I realize up to this point, I haven't told you what I'm making, so it's probably a good idea. I'm going to be making a giant floating media console, and I want the grain to, wrap around so it looks like the sides and the top are all made out of the exact same board, which they are. So this is a super long board right now. It's a little bit over 9 feet, and I want to break those down into the sides and the top, like I just said. So I'm switching over to a fine-tooth blade to make sure that I can get the best cut possible, and I'm going to be using my track saw for this because I don't have a miter saw, and there's no way I can pop this thing up on my table saw with the board being pretty much as wide as my shop is. And huge shout out to my buddy Drew Witt from Whitworks who gave me that custom arbor cover. He sells all kinds of stuff like that, and you should definitely check it out. So to make sure that I get a perfectly 90-degree cut across this board, I'm going to use a track saw square. And I know what you're thinking. Whoa, Eric, you said that that red woodpecker square isn't your favorite. And that's 100% the truth. I filmed this video before I got the new TSO one that I truthfully like way better, but they both work just fine. So you can see that that 45-degree bevel cut gave me a wicked sharp edge directly on that line that I needed. And the next thing I need to do is measure out the final length of this upper cabinet, which is right about 7 feet. So I'm going to make another line right across this board and do the exact same cut there. And whenever I make bevel cuts, I always make a mark so I can visually see exactly what I'm going for, because if I make a mistake now, pretty much the entire thing will be ruined. Again, I'll use that track saw square to get everything dialed into a perfect 90 degree, and then I run my track saw across the board. You can also see that I have a bunch of sacrificial pieces underneath. That's just to help with tear out and to make sure that I'm not cutting into my workbench. And to do the 45-degree cuts on the other side of the pieces, it's going to be way easier to use my table saw. So I'll dial that into a perfect 45 degree, and then I can run all those pieces through a table saw using my miter gauge. Now, I have several miter gauges, and I honestly kind of go back and forth between a lot of them. I wouldn't say I really have any particular one that's my favorite. And to be honest with you, that's one of the products I've considered developing myself. Hey, Eric. And that is something I really would like to get into in the future. Developing products is something I've always been really interested in, even since I was really young. And that's kind of one of my goals for the next 2 to 3 years, is I'd really like to have my own line of woodworking tools and products. So what you saw me do there is just sneak up on that 45-degree cut, and now I can gang both of these side pieces together and cut those down to their final length. And if you're somebody who's interested in building this media console for yourself, obviously you haven't seen the final look of it yet, but you will at the end of the video. I do want to let you know that I have full step-by-step plans that give you every single measurement you need to make sure you can build this thing for yourself. There's a link down in the description, and it's on my website too. You'll find it. So with those bevels cut, I need to join those pieces together to give that look that the grain is going to be wrapping around. And again, no, you do not need to use dominoes, but I find that using an alignment aid, whether it be dominoes, dowels, biscuits, lamellos, whatever it is, helps out a ton when trying to get these miter joints to line up perfectly. I am not doing it for the additional strength.
So before I do anything else with the sides and the top of the case, I need to make up a panel that's going to be for the bottom of the case.
So it's probably really evident here that these boards are definitely a little springy. As you can see when I'm making these marks, they kind of wobble up and down. This is the perfect case for using a domino or, an alignment aid in the middle. Oh, here we go again. Eric, this isn't your joke. You can't be stealing this from other people. Just use the domino like a civilized human being. Anyway, so I'm going to use these... Don't. Oh, stop it. You're embarrassing yourself. I am so sorry that you had to watch that, everybody. All right, so anyway, I got the dominoes in, and you can see this board is a little warped, but it's so long that once I put all the dominoes in and I put the panel together, I can actually kind of pull all of that out. So I'm not really concerned too much about it. I think this is one of the misconceptions that woodworkers have. They think their stuff needs to be absolutely perfect. In reality, no one is ever going to know or see that these boards aren't perfectly flat. It's going to be over such a long stretch, about 7 feet, and no one is ever going to notice. Except you guys, because I just told you that they're not perfectly flat. Damn. Now, this bottom panel is obviously way larger than it needs to be, but I find it way easier to do one panel glue up as opposed to a bunch of small ones. So I made it longer, and I'm going to cut off the ends, and I'm going to save these pieces for a little bit further on in the project, so just remember that here.
But before I cut this side down to its final length, I need to do a referential measurement. So I can pop this panel on with a dry fit, and then do the same thing over here. And because I am not perfect, the length that I want to cut that panel to is actually the distance between these two plus the joinery. I don't care what the plans say right now.
And what I mean by that is, yes, 100%, use those plans to give you a ballpark of where your panel should be at. But the final measurement should be taken off of your actual piece. Because if you're anything like me, you are not going to be perfect. And that's okay.
And now that I've got that bottom panel cut to its final size, it's time to start marking out and cutting the joinery.
Now, this is a perfect example about working smarter, not working harder. I want there to be some like sliding dados, I think that's maybe the term, between these two panels so that the upper and bottom panel have the slots in the exact same spot. Now, absolutely, I could just measure everything, or I could clamp the pieces together and cut the joinery at the exact same time. This will ensure that everything meets up absolutely perfect, and I don't have to worry about making any mismeasurements. It's all done at once, so I really have nothing that I can possibly mess up. Now, you could definitely argue that going through the effort of drawing out where all the joinery is going to be is a waste of time, but I love that visual aid to just really make sure that I know exactly what I'm doing, especially because this is a brand new task that I have never done before. So what I'm doing now is getting the router all dialed in, and I'm actually going to be attaching my router to my track. Never anything I've done before, but apparently it works. And I will slowly work on plunging the router to its final depth. Oh, hello again. Because when using a really small router bit like this 1/4 inch one that I'm using, if you plunge too deep, you're not going to get a very clean cut, and you might actually kind of blow out the cut. So to my surprise, this thing was actually dead on straight. So I moved on to the other side. Now this is one of the things that really excites me about woodworking. Sure, I'm just running a router across a track, making a groove across the boards. What's so exciting about that? Well, it's exciting to me because it's something I've never done before. And when I design these projects, sure, I'm trying to have the overall look of the project be something I really enjoy, something cool, something that, fits within my home. But designing it around specific techniques that I want to try is really what gets me excited. So you can see that I have those panels perfectly lined up, and now if I take them apart, I know that they're going to continue to line up because I cut them together. Now, if you remember from earlier, those dados across the boards are not the only thing that I need to do for joinery. I also need to cut a large groove along the back side of both of those boards, and I could 100% do it with the router, but doing it in the table saw is a little bit faster and cleaner. And I'll be honest with you, every time I put the dado stack in my table saw and turn it on, it makes me a little uncomfortable. There's just so much mass and so many blades spinning right by your face that it makes me a little uneasy. But I got through the cut, no injuries, nothing went wrong, we were all good. Now here's where I ran across yet another problem. Because I have those grooves in the back of the top and bottom, I also need to add them on the side. But I don't want them to go all the way through. I want it to actually be sort of a stop cut on these. It'll make a little bit more sense once you kind of see everything go together, but just stay with me. So over on the router table, I put in a 1/4 inch bit, and I'm going to start hacking away a little bit at that material. Now I could absolutely use a different larger bit to do this faster, but one of the things that I want to make sure is super dialed in is the height. So what I'll do is I'll run this board across the fence on my router table with that little stop so I don't go too far. And you can see I go all the way to that little mark and not anywhere past it. Then I can slide my fence over just a little bit more and work on hacking away all of that material that was in that white line. And if we compare our two boards, you can see that I've got that spot cut out, and I also need to take that white part out.
But due to the layout of this piece, I can't start it here and run it straight through the router fence. And that's because there's going to be a small little lip on the bottom. So if I just ran the piece like that, it'd completely blow through that lip. So in order to cut the joint around this piece, I need to do a little bit of an advanced router table technique.
So what I'm going to do here is move that stop block that I had to the other side of the bit, and I'm going to line my board up with that and slowly plunge or drop it directly on the router bit. Then I can push everything forward, and that will give me the exact cut that I'm looking for. It doesn't go past that line, and I can slowly work on moving the fence over, plowing out all of that material just like I did on the last one. See? Worked like a charm. Now I'm also going to need a dado in the bottom of both of these panels so that the bottom panel can join the two sides. So I mark that out as well, and because I do not want to mess with any of the height settings, I want that cut to be the same height, I left the bit in the router table exactly where it was, and I can make that final cut. You can see it goes all the way to the line, no further.
And then to make the dado in the other piece, again, I gotta do another plunge cut.
And this plunge cut is another thing, just like the router on the track, that I've never done before. And that's what makes things so exciting. I'm always learning and pushing myself. But as you can see, it actually came out perfect. So now that I have the joinery on those side panels of the case knocked out perfectly, I need to move to making the joinery on the bottom panel of the case. And I promise you're going to see everything come together. There's just a lot of technique and intricacies that's going on before I can join everything together. So with my cordless router, I chalked up this rabbiting bit, and again, I marked all the joinery out with a white pencil, and I slowly worked on taking all of that away. Now I've used just about every cordless router on the market, and I'm not sponsored by any of the companies that make them. And I have to say, this DeWalt one is by far the best that I've used. It stops on a dime, super accurate, easy to adjust, and it's got a light. If you're in the market for a cordless palm router, this is the one to get. And now we can get that bottom panel into the sides, and it doesn't fit. But this was all by plan. I need to take a little bit off of that tenon, and to do that, I'm going to use another hand tool, which is a flush trim saw that I'm super thankful that one of my viewers was nice enough to send this out to me. Why do you keep waving? And with that little tab knocked out, you can see that the bottom panel now fits perfectly in the sides. And now we can actually assemble this so you can get an idea of what this crazy cabinet actually looks like.
And just like that, we finally have something that actually resembles the media console that I'm trying to build. But because these panels are so long, there's a lot of bend to them. Now, I knew this was going to happen, which is why I cut out these little grooves in the panels so I just can put in some interior dividers.
So remember those large offcuts that I had from before? That's what these interior dividers are going to be made out of. Now, it's probably a detail nobody but me is ever going to notice, but I did this so that the glue seams where the boards line up are going to match perfectly on these interior dividers. And from the back side, this board fits in those dados that we already cut. So now what I want to do is head over to the router table and start making little tenons on both sides of those internal dividers, but I want to get a perfect fit. So I tested it out with some scrap in this bit, and it was not looking great. So the router gave me a boatload of tear out, as you can see. So I figured going over to the table saw and took a million passes to slowly start working away at that so that I could get the perfect fit for these pieces. When building all these projects, getting a perfect fit on everything can be a challenge. The same goes with running a small business like mine, especially when it comes to banking. But North One can help. North One is an FDIC insured bank account made specifically for small business owners and entrepreneurs. They allow you to integrate sales, process payments, track spending, and receive money through ACH, wires, and debit cards, all in one space, giving you a fully connected banking experience. My favorite feature is that it's completely free. Unlike most of the mega banks out there that nickel and dime you to death, North One doesn't have any monthly fees, minimum balance requirements, or overdraft fees.
All right, I know the setup looks crazy, but it's time to start gluing this up.
Plus, when you're running a business, you know that monitoring cash flow is critical. North One connects to all of your platforms like Stripe, PayPal, Shopify, and many more so that you can understand how much cash you have in your bank account, in transit, and in all of your payment collection accounts.
And yeah, I messed this one up, but not a big deal.
Best of all, it only takes 3 minutes to apply for a business account with North One. It's completely free, and when you download North One with the link below, you'll receive an exclusive $10 credit. So a huge shout out to North One for sponsoring today's video. The most difficult part about gluing up big miter joints like this is getting adequate clamping pressure across the joint. So what I've done is nothing fancy. It's just a bunch of scrap plywood that I glued onto a board to make these giant clamping claws. As you can see, it allows me to put pressure directly across the joint to really make sure that everything gets dialed in perfectly. And I also put some tape inside there that allows me to clean up all that excess glue without making a giant mess. And I find that getting something sharp in there with a towel really helps get the extra glue. And you can see, perfect 90. This is a perfect example of you don't need to buy some super fancy tool to get the job done. This is literally just a bunch of scrap plywood thrown together, and it works like a dream. You don't need to buy some super expensive corner clamps. Just get creative with what you already have in your shop.
All right, now it's time to put the bottom of the case in. But I have a feeling that this piece is going to be a little bit more challenging to put in. So instead of using regular wood glue, I'm going to try using some of this thickened epoxy.
This, just like about everything else I'm doing in this project, is also a brand new technique for me. Whenever I join wood together, I always use wood glue. But the reason that I'm using epoxy is because I want a longer open time. The ability to work with this longer without the glue instantly setting up. And this epoxy will give me that. Plus, since this joinery is fairly snug, the epoxy is not going to swell the wood fibers. It's actually going to act as a little bit of a lubricant to make sure that I can get everything in. Want to see another DIY hack that'll save you tons of money from buying expensive clamps? I just took some scrap plywood, put a couple bolts in it, and I can actually bolt these two clamps together. So now I have about a 8-foot long clamp, and for these 7-foot long panels, I can now get perfect clamping pressure across these. All I spent was about $1 in hardware. You gotta try this one. Works great. And now that I've got the top, the sides, and the bottom all joined together, I'm gonna use some more of that thickened epoxy from Total Boat, baby.
What the f***, Eric? That's mine. Total boat, baby.
Sorry about that, Keith. So again, I'm gonna use this epoxy, 1, because it won't swell up the joints, 2, it'll lubricate everything, and 3, just in the off chance that it's not absolutely flawless, it'll fill a little bit of the gaps and make sure that this is a rock solid joinery method. The one downside to using epoxy is that it is kind of a nightmare to clean up, which is why I put that tape around the joints to try to minimize all the cleanup that I'll have to do later. This is one thing that I've definitely kind of learned as I've done more woodworking. Taking the extra time, like with that tape on the joints, makes your life way easier. It seems like it's slowing you down, but in reality, it's actually faster to do it this way.
And thanks to movie magic, the epoxy is totally cured. Now let's get some drawer fronts on this thing. So to save you the energy off camera, I went ahead and milled down some other boards I'm going to be using to make up another panel for all of those drawer fronts of the media console.
So with the drawer fronts, one small detail that people often overlook is the grain. So I want it to look like the grain is flowing all the way across all 3 drawer fronts. And to do that, I'm going to do one big panel. And you can see this is what I mean by the panels not being perfectly flat. But I'll show you why I'm not really too concerned about that in a little bit. The first thing I need to do to make sure I can get these boards to line up perfectly is to joint the edges. This is what I call the folding technique. I'm going to take off just a little bit from each of these boards, and by folding those boards the way that I did, I can then unfold them, and I'm going to have a perfectly jointed edge that even if my track saw isn't exactly at 90 degrees, the boards are still going to meet up perfectly. Now, would a jointer be faster? Absolutely. But I don't have one. So because you saw that those boards are not perfectly flat, again, I'm going to use some more dominoes. I think one of the big misconceptions when people glue up panels is that they have to put dominoes or dowels or biscuits or whatever because they have to make everything super strong. In reality, the only reason you're doing this is to align the panels. Gluing up long grain to long grain wood like this is going to be way stronger than any of the alignment aids that you put on the inside. It's just done for alignment, not strength. I've premeditated where I'm going to be cutting these door panels down so that I don't expose any of those domino tenons while I make the cut. But you can see I kind of struggled to get all this together, and that's what the dominoes are doing. They're pulling everything together so that these boards line up perfectly. Now, I spend a lot of time on these projects, and I spend a lot of time filming them. Sometimes I get so distracted and worried about, oh, is the camera on? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? That I make silly mistakes. So, to try to make things easy for me, I'll spend a little bit of extra time to plan things out before I make cuts. So, in this example, I put that green tape over where I know I'm going to be cutting down the drawer fronts, and if you look on the sides, you can see that I also have marked the edges with a little bit of white marker so that I know that is where it's safe to cut those drawer fronts and I won't hit those domino tenons that are inside. Also, because I want to make sure that the door fronts look perfect, adding that tape just gives me a little bit extra insurance policy that I won't have tons of, chip out from the grain. And this is another example of where I kind of ditched the plans and instead use referential measurements to know exactly where I need to cut the final length for these door fronts. I think that's another mistake that a lot of woodworkers make. They think that if they didn't follow that plan just absolutely perfectly, that they failed on the project. I don't think I've ever perfectly followed a plan. You will never know that whoops, that could have been bad.
Make sure you clamp your board better than I did because that was really scary while I was making that cut.
You'll never know that I accidentally made this case about 3/8 of an inch too short. It doesn't matter. I just adapted on the fly. But now that I know that panel is the right overall length, I can go back to the case and mark out exactly where I want the doors to be cut. And once I have that larger door front panel broken down into all 3 individual sections, you can see that it's got that grain wrapped all the way around it, which is kind of a cool look, extra detail that I think a lot of people will like.
Now you could absolutely just take these drawer fronts and attach them to the case. But because these panels are solid wood, I want to add a little bit of an insurance policy.
So here is yet another thing that I've never attempted to do. Because these panels are solid wood, they might have a tendency to warp over time. So what I'm gonna do is add some braces. And to do that, I'm cutting a dovetail slot in them. Again, not one that goes all the way through, but one that actually kind of stops. Just like that. And see, just like before, I've got a stopped router cut, but I need to do the same thing on the opposite side of the board. So to make this work, I actually had to work from the opposite side of my router table, which was a little awkward, but it ended up working okay. Just make sure that you turn the router off before you pull the board out, because you don't want to mess up this cut. So now that all the door fronts have those dovetail slots cut in them, I also need to cut the pieces out that are going to go inside those slots to hold everything perfectly flat.
These are too wide.
This is something that I didn't model before I started building this. I typically do model every single project that I do on the computer before I start building it, but this is something that I kind of came up with on the fly. But now I need to break that one long strip that's going to be the dovetail brace down into some shorter, more manageable pieces so that I can cut the joinery into them. And again, to make sure I don't make any mistakes, I'm going to take this piece over and mark out kind of what I'm going for. So I want to remove that section there and this section right there. It'll be rough right at this time, but you can see on this piece, I dial in that visual indication so I really know exactly what I'm going for. And I'm going to start off by removing the majority of that material on the table saw. This will make everything much easier on my router bit, and it'll save me a lot of time. So you can see that that first cut gets me pretty close to the dovetail, and I also need to run the board on its side to remove that extra little bit. Just be careful to not stand behind it because that piece is going to shoot back right at you, but not too bad. You can see that the table saw took care of the majority of the waste, and since I didn't touch that dovetail bit, I know that it's at the exact same height as it was for the doors, so I can slowly nibble away the excess wood to get everything dialed in so you get a perfect fit. Now this is one thing that you absolutely do not want to rush. You want to take your time and really work into this joint. The worst thing that you could possibly do is make this too loose, which I almost did, but this is a pretty good fit. But just like before, you'll notice that it doesn't go all the way in, so I need to cut out a notch just like I had done on that bottom panel to fit into the sides of the case too. This is easy, can just use the table saw and slowly nibble away at that stuff. And then look at me, I'm using another hand tool, this time a chisel, to get that little excess out. Not a pro at a chisel, but I gotta say, they've become nice. So now you can see that I can slide that all the way in and it fits absolutely perfectly. Now I want to add a little bit of spice, a little bit of finesse, a little bit of pizzazz to these pieces. So back over at the router table, I put in a chamfer bit and I'm just going to lightly chamfer these little dovetail brace pieces for the doors. That way it looks a little bit more intentional and a little bit more stylized. You could also do this by hand, but I think the router is a lot easier. Now to anchor these pieces into the doors, I'm going to add some screws only at the top. But before I go and assemble these little dovetail braces into the doors themselves, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier if I finish everything now. But I do not want to get any finish into those dovetail slots, so I'm going to put, again, some masking tape over these areas so that I don't have to worry about the oil penetrating in there. And speaking of oil, I'm going to be using a 2-part hard wax oil. Super easy. All you do is take a little bit out in a syringe, put it in a cup, and then you take a smaller amount of the hardener, put it in the same cup, mix it all up. It's not nasty, actually smells pretty good, and it's super easy to apply. You literally can't mess it up. The application process is super simple. After everything is mixed up thoroughly, you're going to pour just a little bit all over the surface. Then you're going to spread it around with a white Scotch-Brite pad, and this just kind of abrades it and works it into the wood itself. And then after you've got everything thoroughly covered, you're going to let it sit for just a little bit, and then you can wipe off all the excess. That's it. You don't have to wait days and days before you can touch stuff. No weird polyurethane. And if you want to get really fancy, on flat surfaces, you can use a little plastic squeegee. It's kind of fun to play with. Now, I let that oil set up overnight, but it's really not necessary. And I can take that masking tape off to expose the raw wood. Now, I can place that dovetail brace into the door itself, and at the very last moment, apply glue just to the end, and then I can pound this thing home. Now, the reason that I only put glue at the top is because that's the part that I want to stay fixed. And to help it stay fixed there, I'm also going to be putting in screws at the top. By not having any wood at the bottom, it will allow this panel to expand and contract over time, but I don't have to worry about it warping with those dovetail braces in there. And to address that large amount of tear out that I had before, I've got a plan. I'm going to run these. Okay, I guess I blew the circuit breaker again. So yet another challenge of working out of this small garage. But anyway, I can run these door panels through the table saw and trim off the tiniest amount so that I get rid of all of that tear out that was there to really clean things up. And look, I have a perfect joint there. But because I want everything to match, I'm going to bring out yet another hand tool, small little hand plane, and get that chamfer dialed in perfectly. The hand plane is actually pretty nice. I'll admit it. But now it's time for a little bit of hardware. So I'm going to be installing some hinges on this. And to do it, I'm going to be using this concealed hinge jig. This thing is super nice, but it isn't going to fit here. But I have an idea. It's just plastic. So I took it over to the table saw and decided, I don't know, I guess I'll cut a big chunk of it off so it fits in the spot that I need it to fit in. This is definitely not the best solution, but it's all I could really come up with at the time. And look, now it fits perfectly where I need it to go. And then once I attach the bit to my drill, I can drill out those hinge cups. But this is one thing that doesn't work great about this. It always clogs up with tons of wood chips, and I wish I had a better solution for that. But once you suck everything out, you take another drill with a teeny tiny drill bit, and this is going to be the pre-drilled holes for the screws that are going to hold the hinge into place on the door. But with all of that work, you can pop that off and you can see that that hinge fits perfectly into place. Now to secure it in place, I'm just going to use those pre-drilled holes and drive in a couple small screws to make sure that this hinge is locked in tight. Now over back on the cabinet, I'm going to put the hinge mounting plates in. Now this is one thing that I'll be completely honest with you. I haven't found a real good foolproof method for figuring out exactly where these need to go, so I kind of just do trial and error on some scrap. Now, because these cabinets are so tight, I found that these little right angle drill guides, which I'll link down in the description, work super well. And now all I have to do is clip these hinges in and look at this. Soft close, baby. But the lip is a little extended, but that was on purpose. I purposefully made these a little bit longer and look, grabbed another hand tool, that little block plane, and I'm going to slowly dial in the exact length that I need for these. And if you look closely, underneath I put some little shims to make sure that the door doesn't, slide up and down. And then I can get a perfect fit for those.
So now with the door hardware attached, I can lift up the door to get access to the inside, but the only problem, they don't want to stay up.
Now, this is a pretty common problem, and what a lot of people do is they will take a small blue pill, but I didn't want to get any pharmaceuticals involved, so I decided to use this little hardware jig thing. I basically screw one to the side of the cabinet,
Then just grab this little support, pop it on. Oh, son of a... I put this on the top. It's supposed to be on the bottom.
I thought about leaving that part out, but I like to be honest and show you that I mess up projects too. Just because I'm making these videos on YouTube does not mean that they turn out perfectly. Look, I made the cabinet too small. I messed up the dovetail key thing. There was tons of tear out. I put the hinges on the wrong side like you just saw. I do all kinds of stuff that doesn't work out. And you probably do the same thing when you're making your projects as well. It's normal. It happens. And you know what? I messed up again. If I have the hinge that close, the door is never going to close. So I had to move it even further back. And now I can attach these support arms to the doors. This is one thing that I find really challenging. The instructions never seem to be all that helpful, and I find myself having to make a lot of just trial and error solutions to try to figure out how to actually use hardware like this. But at the end of the day, I got it all situated, and now I can clip that on there. And with about a 1/16 of an inch of space, it actually works. So now right side up, it holds the door up, and then when I close it, a nice soft close. Now I'm going to take that case over off to the side, and I'm going to shift my attention towards filling up the back of that case. And to do that, I'm not going to bother making a hardwood panel because that's just completely unnecessary. Instead, I'm going to use some 1/4 inch walnut veneered plywood. I'll just take this back over to the workbench, zip off the ends, and now I've got this thing that fits perfectly inside the back, and hopefully nobody notices it's plywood, but you shouldn't really look inside there anyway, so we're all good. Now I know what you're thinking. Eric, how in the world are you going to hang this thing on the wall? Well, don't you worry. I've thought through that too. So I've got some extra walnut hardwood left over that's about 3/4 of an inch thick that I could cut down, and I'm actually going to use my jigsaw here. Why? People always say the jigsaw is a horrible tool, but if you have the right blade and you go slow, you can get a really good cut with it. That is a perfectly square cut with a jigsaw. It just takes patience. Now back over at the media console, I can see that this thing fits perfectly in the back. So the way that I'm going to mount this to the wall is a little special technique that I like to call a freedom cleat. So what I'm going to do is at the table saw, I'm going to tilt my blade to right around 45 degrees, but to be completely honest with you, the exact angle is kind of irrelevant. And I'm basically going to rip this board perfectly in half. What this is going to do is provide me 2 pieces that meet up with one another, and I can attach one to the wall, one to the cabinet, and they're going to slide onto each other. Like I said, one is going to attach to the upper part of the cabinet, the other one's going to go on the wall. But what I need to do is get one more small piece. This is going to go on the bottommost part of the cabinet, and it's just going to help hold that plywood back panel in place and give things just a little bit more rigidity. And here's why I'm really enjoying using these hard wax oil products when I'm building my projects. Instead of building the entire project and then spraying it down with polyurethane, I can instead finish small pieces one at a time, making things way easier. Like this back panel, I can just use a sander and buff it all in, as opposed to having to reach inside the cabinet at the end and have to deal with a really awkward finishing process. I just finish each piece at once, assemble things, and I'm all set. I have found that when finishing large surfaces like this, it's definitely way easier to abrade that oil in using the white Scotch-Brite pad on a power sander as opposed to doing it by hand. 1, it's a lot faster, and 2, it doesn't give you all that hand fatigue. Just kind of think through things ahead of time and figure out if you have the space to get that sander in there, and if not, maybe do it before you assembled the cabinet. These are the types of things that you learn as you build. And the more projects you build, you're going to realize that you have a sort of preference towards one thing or another. There's nothing wrong with experimenting, trying new techniques, new processes, but at the end of the day, just find what works for you, and as long as it's working, that's fine. Don't worry about what other people are doing. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do to these doors is I'm going to add a little bevel on the bottom side. That way I have a spot for my finger to reach in and grab to open the door, because I really don't want any exposed hardware. And now that I've got all of the pieces covered in oil, I can start assembling the case. I'm going to first put in that back plywood piece. I'm not really going to put any glue immediately. Then I'm going to put a bead of glue on top of that plywood panel, and then I can add in those back support pieces. So what these are going to do is, 1, it's going to keep the cabinet more rigid. 2, it's going to hold that plywood piece in place. And 3, because one of them is the freedom cleat, it'll make sure that I actually have a way to attach this thing to the wall. And yes, you're going to need a lot of clamps to make sure you get plenty of clamping pressure across this thing, but just make sure that you put some pads and stuff before you put all these clamps on. That way you don't mar anything up. And just for an extra security policy, a little, belt and suspenders method, I'm also going to drive some screws in from the back into those center divider things. So I'm just going to pre-drill and countersink those holes and then drive in some screws. Nothing crazy. You'll never see this. It's against the wall. And before I take this thing inside, I'm going to add just a little bit more finish on the back. Probably not really necessary, but it makes me feel good. And now let's take this inside and get this thing mounted. So I brought out the laser level just to make sure that this thing is even and it's exactly where I want it. Then I'm going to pre-drill some holes into the studs and then attach the bottom part of the freedom cleat to the wall. Once I know that this freedom cleat is perfectly level, I'm going to adhere it to the wall, again, making sure that it actually hits the studs with some nice long screws. And then I can take that massive cabinet and set it on top of that freedom cleat. And of course, if you've got wires or outlets or other things behind the cabinet, you might have to cut a little hole in that plywood, but now you've got yourself a perfect floating media console with nice, crisp, modern look.
All right, I gotta get to work on the next project, so I'll see you on the next one.